I always laugh because a lot of people who know me say that I always start off with my story. And I do that for a variety of reasons. I do it partially because I believe all knowledge is subjective and we bring who we are to anything that we're trying to understand. I believe in being reflexive about it, being thoughtful about that, to really understand my own biases, my own standpoint, and how I bring that to anything that I'm looking at, particularly when I think about producing knowledge and what that actually means and my role in that. I also believe in transparency. It's like let me be clear. I'm not trying to hide anything. I'm not trying to be tricky. Like, this is who I am. My work, one of the things I am as a professor, it's only one of the things. Before I'm any of those things, I'm a human being. I'm a person with a life. And so very particularly, I've been focusing on difference and environment, very specifically African Americans. So I just completed my first book looking at African Americans and environmental issues in the United States. So I started off telling about my own story. I'm originally from New York. My parents were, because they've changed. In the 50s, my parents grew up in the South, small town. They were poor. They both had high school education. They moved north like a lot of African Americans did in the 50s, thinking they would have better job opportunities. My father had just come back from the Korean War, and he had two job options. One, he could be a janitor in Syracuse, New York, or another one, he could be about a half an hour outside of city. There's a well-known family. They have their own building in the city that deals in real estate that had an estate. And they needed somebody to be the caretaker for that estate, to live on that estate, to be the chauffeur caretaker. And so my parents took that job. So I grew up on this estate. It's literally, it's in Westchester County, very wealthy white neighborhood. We were the only family of color there. And even now, for a brief period of time, there was a Japanese American woman, and she moved, so it's still predominantly a wealthy, very wealthy white neighborhood. I tell people Harry Winston's got property down the street. Wingfoot Golf Club is around the corner. Serious money. Beautiful estate, apple trees, small ponds, swimming pool, gardens, which my father and my mother were responsible for caring for. The owners came up on weekends and holidays. They moved there in the late 50s. They wanted to have kids. They thought they couldn't have any kids, so they adopted me. And then they relaxed, as I like to say, and had two boys. So I have two brothers. Because the owners only came on weekends and holidays for the most part, during the week, my brothers and I had run of that property. So, and the property was just stunning to live on. I think we just kind of not took it for granted, but your kids, you're like, we played outside. My father was always home, which wasn't always a great thing, but because that's where his work was. But we had that experience of being outside in that environment in a very particular way. And it wasn't ours. So when I think about issues of ownership, it was never ours. When I think about, I always tell the story when I was about 9, I think in terms of the color of my skin started to come into play. Walking home from school, I was in 4th grade. I had a little afro with my little reading glasses, pretty unimpressive. And there was always cops patrolling the neighborhood because it was a wealthy neighborhood. And being stopped by a cop who wanted to know where I was going. I was just right around the corner from the house, and I explained it to him. And he said, "Oh, do you work there?" And I'm thinking, I'm 9, but I didn't say anything. I said, no, I live there. It was really confusing for me. And I think that was probably the first time I became specifically conscious about my difference and my family's difference. And, even the man couldn't look at a 9-year-old girl with a school bag and make what I would have considered a more logical assessment that I must be going home from school. I'm 9. For him, he saw the color of my skin and imagined the only way I could be here is if I was working, even though I was only 9. So, sort of flash forward to today, and partly when I started my doctorate in 1999, I had originally been looking at issues of gender and environment abroad, and I eventually shifted for a number of reasons to look at race and environment at home. At that time, my parents had to leave the property. The original owners, one had died a while ago. The other owner was dying and had to think about what happens to my family. They've been on this land for 50 years, been caring for this land. What's going to happen to them? There was some talk about them maybe being able to stay on this property. The property taxes would have been more than $125,000 a year, and my parents didn't make that kind of money, didn't have that kind of savings. So eventually they had a house built back in Virginia, which is where they're from. And for the last, I would say, I guess almost 10 years now, they've been living full time in Virginia. My father has been fairly depressed this whole time. He would go back to New York. If he could be allowed to go back, he'd go back like that. And it causes me to think about attachment to place, what's real ownership, knowledge, what people know and what counts, because my parents knew that property better than anyone, including the owners. Partially because they had to know, through work, through living on that property, they had to understand, why are the trees dying over here? Why is there fungus on the pond? What does it mean when we see a proliferation of wild geese there? And how do you deal with those issues? And partially, and I'm just going to say this, because I think they love that property. They come to love, you can come to love a place like you can come to love a person. And then recognizing you have no real control over whether or not you can stay on that place over time, I think that's a loss there. The last thing I want to say about that is that a few years ago, my parents shared with me a letter they'd gotten from one of the neighbors, because their neighbors, whenever there's anything going on, there's a new owner on that property. I've met him. What's interesting now there's a family from Latin America living on the property, which is kind of interesting as well. The owner had, there is now a conservation easement placed on that property. A conservation organization in Westchester had sent around letters to neighbors, letting them know that the new owner, he's very conservation minded. Isn't this a wonderful thing? Why a conservation easement is going to be placed on this property, which means no new structures can be built in perpetuity there. And I talked about all the flora and fauna that are present on that property and why it's an important property in that particular watershed. I read this letter, and there was nothing in there thanking my parents for all the work they had done for 50 years. And I'm not dissing the new owner. I can be a little cynical and say, perhaps part of the reason why he's put a conservation easement on, because it means he doesn't have to pay any more taxes on the property. And he also may be conservation minded. But how do you not think the people who lived on that land and cared for it for 50 years? And then I start thinking about all the people in this country and beyond the borders of this country who have cared for, who have worked on, who have lived with land and other resources for years, but don't get any acknowledgement. Or they're the backstory, the backstory to the prime story here. It really causes me to think about what real ownership means. It makes me think about issues of belonging. It makes me think about who has political and economic power to make environmental decisions. It makes me think about issues of identity and how people define themselves, and how land and place is intertwined with how we think about ourselves and who we are. And sometimes we don't realize that. But what happens when these places get taken away from you? What happens when you're not acknowledged? And how that place has been cared for, constructed, how the knowledge about it has been constructed over time. When your contribution isn't considered, doesn't that also say something about you and how you are being perceived, perhaps as not being important, as contributing, as having something valuable to add to the larger conversation about environment? So,
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.